Welcome to Hashtag Trending, the Weekend Edition. I'm your host, Jim Love. I did an interview with Senator Colin Deacon a few weeks back, and something he said got into my head, and I can't get it out. You can't succeed in a digital economy with an analog government. It's stuck with me for 2 weeks now. And because clearly we are not succeeding. We have an enormous productivity gap in our country. In 1984, Canadian productivity was 88% of the U.S. level, and that was pretty bad. By 2022, it's fallen to 71% of the U.S. Now, not that we regulate ourselves totally in terms of the U.S., but it's a benchmark, and we're losing the game. And we're losing not because we're lazy, not because we're not creative. It's not even because we're not spending. Canadian businesses admittedly spend less on research and development than any other GDP countries. I think Portugal spends more than us. And nothing against Portugal, but we're a G7 country. But maybe, just maybe, it's not how much we spend, but how well we spend it. We spend a lot of money on technology. We buy a lot. But somehow that purchasing isn't leading to greater productivity or increased innovation. And it's true that Canadian businesses don't invest in research and development, but our government does. We have significant investments in our universities. We contributed greatly to the development of artificial intelligence. Last week, I did a story on how we're pushing the envelope on quantum computing. We have grant programs aimed at businesses, and we spend a fair amount of money on these programs. So why don't we see more results? One leading business person I asked about this said, actually posed the question back to me. He said, how many of those new ideas, those patents, those innovations are actually commercialized in Canada? Not enough. We don't drive our innovation into a commercial reality. But we know that when Canadians are given the chance, we can do this. We can innovate. We can sell around the world. We've created giants like Research in Motion. We have current giants like Shopify. We've innovated with companies like Vancouver's D-Wave that put the first commercial quantum computer into use. But still, despite our spending, despite our successes, we're not developing the type of high-growth Canadian companies that we need to fuel innovation and growth in our economy. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. And I think we can safely assume that private investment is not going to magically fill that gap immediately. But can we rely on government to do the job? I have to say, government seems to be better at announcing programs than delivering results. In 2017, the government set a goal to double the number of high-growth Canadian firms from 14,000 to 28,000. They actually got somewhere around 10,700, somewhere around there. Just let those numbers sink in. But governments can do this, and other governments around the world have generated results. Yes, they have grant programs, but they also leverage their purchasing power to develop innovation in businesses. In the U.S., yes, you heard me right, the commercial U.S., their government invests heavily in defense and digital technologies. Even tiny companies like Finland and Sweden have huge telecom companies initially driven by government procurement, and now doing business around the world. And even little Estonia, you probably don't even know where it is, and it's a country of 1 million people. That country leverages every dollar in government spending to drive private sector investment and innovative e-government solutions. And you have to see the explosion of entrepreneurial businesses there. They are getting results, and they get respect around the world for what they're doing in e-government. It's no surprise when people say we need to leverage our government purchasing power to drive innovation. It's a great idea. We spend billions. We spend about 15% of our gross domestic product on purchasing of goods and services. But what innovative companies need are customers. And if we could leverage the purchasing power to buy innovative, productivity building Canadian solutions, it would be a win. And in the digital space, the need was never greater. Canadian government digital technology, let's just be kind, say it needs a lot of work. Our government systems are old and need more than refreshing. They need transformation. Our e-government leadership has fallen off a cliff. In 2003, I was going around the world teaching e-government from Canada. And at that time, we were ranked somewhere around 6th in the world in e-government development. Today, we're in 32nd place. The only other G7 country to do worse is Italy in 37th place. And the systems we have are not only old, they're ineffective. 62% of public servants think unreliable technology affects the quality of their work. So it makes immense sense to say, why don't we leverage our procurement systems to drive innovation and productivity? And one reason, to be honest, we aren't very good at it. We know all about the disastrous Phoenix project. That reality is big, but our success numbers across the board aren't very good. Procurement is broken. And I hate saying this because I know when we say it honestly, that we suck at procurement, and that's the real reality. Our country is suffering and our prosperity is threatened because of it. It drives reactions that are, let's just say they're unproductive. It feeds those who want to make this a political argument. It's the liberals, it's Trudeau, whatever. And that's a lie. I'll give you one word, Phoenix. Phoenix was developed by the conservative government. The reality is the problem isn't politicians or political parties. No political party has given us a solution. And the problem, when we admit it honestly, also feeds those who want to make jokes about civil servants and make out that they're lazier and that they're not innovative. And nothing could be further from the truth. I worked with a digital governance council. They bring together some of the best people in the industry and government who are trying to drive digital innovation. I have friends in the CIO Association who are in government, and some of them are amazing leaders. But even in working as a consultant to governments, you could find so many people who are absolutely first class in their thinking, who work hard and want government to succeed. So why isn't it working? Or maybe there's a better question. How do we fix it? And then I got an email from a group called the Council of Canadian Innovators. They put out a report called Buying Ideas, Procuring Public Sector Innovation in Canada. And they've kindly sent a representative to our program. Our guest today is Laurent Carbonneau, and he's representing the Council of Canadian Innovators and this incredible report. Welcome, Laurent.
Thank you so much. A real pleasure to be here. And I gather from the opening crawl there that you have read it in quite some detail. So I look forward to this conversation.
I've read it and lived it. And every time, every word jumped off the page. I looked at this and said, oh man, this is the real world. But before we get to the report, let's orient ourselves. Tell me more about the Council of Canadian Innovators. Who are you and why did you do this incredible report?
Absolutely. So the Council of Canadian Innovators, or CCI, as we usually call it around the virtual office, is a business council that represents 150 of Canada's fastest growing technology companies that are all domestically headquartered. So it's a wide range, a big club of the CEOs. And our job is to really put forward and put them at the heart of innovation policymaking in Canada, really around the idea that what companies need to scale is access to talent, access to capital, access to customers, and the right marketplace frameworks.
Yeah. And tell me a little bit about you. What drew you to work with this group? I've read your resume. It's quite impressive. But what brought you to this group?
It was an interesting circuitous route. So my first job when I moved to Ottawa was working for, my first full-time job working in Ottawa was for Charlie Angus, the Northern Ontario NDP MP.
Oh, Charlie. He's doing a concert near me. I saw him a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. So I worked for Charlie for 2 years. And in that time, I went through the 2017 leadership race, and this is what got me into this world indirectly, is the Sidewalk Labs episode in Toronto, and working on as well the Cambridge Analytica scandal and all of the sort of global fallout from that on big tech. It came at the technology industry actually from a very critical place, and then spent some more time on the Hill, worked in the leader's office, then went on to work in post-secondary government relations for Universities Canada. And then I got a call at some point from the folks at CCI who I'd met a couple of times when I was on the Hill, just working on these files, and said, hey, would you want to come do this job here? And I said yes, and went over, and I've been here about a year and change now. So an odd diagonal slide into this world.
Yeah. I've met all kinds of different politicians, and nobody comes to work trying to waste government money. They may have policy differences, but they're all trying to solve this problem. The question is, why can't we? And we'll get to that. The proposal you've made in the report is that government procurement, if it's used well, could help address this innovation and even the productivity gap. So how is that?
Sure. At a really high level, you talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but there's two ways that you can do innovation policy if we're really zooming out all the way here. And one of them is on the supply side. What are the innovation inputs and how do we have more of them, right? And that's, we do stuff like funding research through the tri-agencies and through universities. We do stuff like grants and tax breaks for businesses. And all of that is like, it's a suite of policies. It's a very big suite of policies. I think I saw the figure the other day. It's 170 plus programs. So there's a lot of them. Mixed effectiveness. Some of them are quite good. Some of them are not performing as well. But if you zoom out, that's all the supply side. On the demand side, we really don't have much. And I'll say, like, there are some programs. There's the IDEAS program at Department of National Defense. There's Innovative Solutions Canada. But the idea with demand side programs, it's really, instead of using government as a supply of funds to supply the market with researchers and with money to do research, what if government was a source of demand for innovation? And other countries have treated this as a sort of a balanced approach that you do both and you see what you get. In Canada, we have really historically neglected the demand side of the equation almost completely.
Yeah, and actually, I think discouraged it would be better. I was a government procurement consultant at one point, and I saw it up close. And like I said, there are people who are trying to do a good job, but it's set up to buy from large American companies. That's
Absolutely.
really what, and nothing against American companies, but I'd like to buy from some Canadian ones too. And everything is stacked in that. At least that's my impression. Tell me, if we say we want to leverage government procurement, and I buy this supply side argument you make, but if we want to leverage government procurement as part of that, we have to admit it's broken, don't we?
Yeah, and I think the report, as you'll have seen, like definitely reckons with that reality that the baseline is a status quo that is really not working for anybody, right? It's not just for innovators. It's really not working for public servants. Like, you ask any public servant who has to deal with the procurement system, they're enormously frustrated. And, I always hesitate to get into this because it's not my book so much, but the ArriveCan piece of the recent months, right? I think that to me is a symptom of a system that's not working rather than a sort of reason we shouldn't try to change the system. I've had some reactions to the report. People say, oh, you want to take more risks? What about ArriveCan? And I think the structure of this, where it makes more sense to find someone who's a head shop who can subcontract and backfill the needs versus paying someone for a good or service, it seems revolutionary in that system, right? Like, the complexity is really part of the problem. And this sort of, I get into this in the report, but what we talk about is that there's two kinds of things that the government has to buy, right? And one is staplers, which is to say it's any kind of thing where the dimensions of the problem are really well understood. And really what you're doing is just trying to compete on cost. And the system is actually pretty good at buying staplers. I don't think I've never talked to a public servant who said, I find the staplers really to be a problem. But if you try to do anything that doesn't fit into a stapler-sized box of a completely well-understood, completely articulated problem set with completely articulated solutions, then you run into real problems. And this is where a lot of our companies who are working on novel technologies really run into problems, because they will try to interface with these RFPs, requests for proposals that the government's putting forward. And they find that it's either that what they want is so defined that, okay, our approach to this problem isn't covered in this RFP, so we can't put our names forward. Or they find that if there even is some dialogue, there are some concerns that when they have those conversations or inquire a little bit about, hey, can you specify what you're looking for in this area? Because all of that communication is public, they're worried that by communicating and asking suggestive questions, they are publicizing essentially what their strategic or technical approach is, which can put their IP in jeopardy. So this is the surface level, but yeah, absolutely. I think the system doesn't work as this.
Yeah, I've seen this up front. You can't propose a new solution to a government RFP. You just can't. You're going to get blown out. So what you want to do is meet all of their requirements, even if those requirements won't solve the problem. And
yes, there's a great book that came out last year by Jennifer Palka, who helped set up the U.S. Digital Service. And she describes that problem as concrete boats, which is, if they want me to build the concrete boat, I'll build it. But it's not actually a problem-solving approach. It's just pure box checking. It doesn't really move the needle on innovation or, frankly, on meeting the government's needs.
Yeah. Another thing you pointed out in your report is that, and this is very real, is when you, instead of focusing on the problem and trying to solve that bit by bit in smaller increments, which is probably the best way to try and solve problems, the government tries to specify everything. they have to over-specify because you can't open these things up. It's a huge problem.
Mm-hmm.
But are there other problems with procurement that we need to tackle as well?
I think there's a cultural issue where, and this is a bigger problem, right? I think the problem with procurement is people are trying to be responsible stewards of public money. As you said, no one gets into this to do bad things, really, or at least it's very rare, and we have appropriate mechanisms to deal with that in the form of law enforcement. But really the issue is that because the reaction to any time something has gone wrong has been to add more layers of accountability and oversight, you eventually end up with just such a stifling set of these measures that everyone is afraid to do anything. And frankly, I think some of this is on political leadership too, where there's really, and this has been articulated a lot, is that there's a demand for error-free government, right? And that when you are working to just minimize errors at all costs, people don't really think about what at all costs mean, but the costs can be really high. And this is something we talk about in the report a lot with respect to culture, is that I think the way that the internal psychological market of the public service works is that if you are, the worst thing that can happen is you do something and it doesn't go well. If you don't do something and it doesn't go well, that's less of a problem. Or if you do something and it goes well, then that's nice, but the upside is limited. That quadrant is really, really skewed towards avoiding doing something and it doesn't go well. And I think that socially, politically, I think we just need to have kind of an adult realization that error-free government is not possible. And certainly when we're talking about innovation, like, we're always moving along learning curves. There are always going to be new technologies, and not everything is going to go swimmingly every single time. But like, every government that is confident in investing in the future and investing in itself and its own capabilities has to take risks. And frankly, we just are not good at that. And we've seen the costs of that in really creaky government services and in an innovation programming that hasn't met its results. Excellent.
And I urge people to read the report because I think you've outlined the problem. I think we've defined the problems really well. Question is, what is the solution to this? What can we do?
Yeah. We make 6 recommendations in the report. I won't get to all of them. Some of them are fairly granular, but the way we see it is you need a mix of big and small, some very blunt instruments, and also some quite targeted sort of scalpel-like measures. So on the blunt instrument side, the first recommendation we had was a SME procurement target for innovation, to say that the government should take a certain percentage of its procurement spend and earmark that for innovation through SMEs. And that is an approach that the US has taken to some extent. There's some kind of asterisk around that with SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research, which is a program where basically every agency of the government, including Defense Department and its branches, have to spend a certain amount of their research dollars on small businesses. A system that's actually worked really well. The outcomes of that you see, for instance, it's actually, speaking about the risk part, the companies that SBIR, it's really hard to say, are a little more likely to fail than average. But on the other hand, they're also more likely to result in IPOs, to file patents, to have academic research published out of them. So they're seeing outsized innovation impacts. And they're also taking place in sectors where venture capital is less willing to go. So more into capital intensive, more difficult technical problem sectors like biotech, deep tech like semiconductors, that kind of stuff. So it's filling a market niche really and advancing the technological frontier in ways that even venture capital markets don't often want to take the risks on. So sorry, that was one point.
Yeah, no, I think that, and a very real one. You've got to tackle this risk thing though. We're not doing so well now. Something like your report says something like 8% of large projects succeed.
Yes.
And 70% of smaller ones that make it. So I think we're actually lying to ourselves about the fact that going to smaller businesses is riskier. Lots of companies buy from small businesses now, and they get things done.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, you talked about it, but Phoenix did not exactly come from a small company. These things there is a certain seeming law in project management that the larger the project is, the likelier it is to fail or go over on cost or time. Having lots of little projects when it comes to innovation, especially, is going to yield more fruit.
Yeah. And there's a sort of a fake argument that people, can you favor these smaller companies? You sure can favor big companies.
Yeah, and you're not just favoring them. And there is like explicit, sometimes I've had people tell me like, oh, like this RFP was written basically with a competitor's trademark in it. So what am I supposed to do here? But also, frankly, it's just the timelines. A lot of the time, you have big companies that can afford to wait months and months for an RFP response and the back and forth and all of that. And you have small companies that often this is not worth their while. Like the government is not a good customer, and we should want the government to be a good customer for, frankly, all companies, but especially small, innovative ones.
Yeah. And the other thing that drove me crazy when I was working with government, I hope they're still not doing it, but I imagine they are. They used to have this fairness commissioner who would come in and say, you can't ask tough questions. And it goes to this idea of you have to tell everybody everything. And we go, wait a minute. You bring a business in here and they're going to discuss their ideas with you. And you brought this up about giving away your IP. You're going to bring a business in here. They're going to discuss the ideas with you and you're going to give them to all their competitors. That's just not fair.
Yeah, no, it's wild. And certainly it's something that I've taken to heart talking, because I think if you tell most Canadians off the hop, oh yeah, like they're required to, if you're doing back and forth with government on procurement, that's required to be public. I think most people would say, yeah, it seems reasonable. But yeah, and that works for staplers, right? This is one of those pieces, again, where the idea is that not everything is a stapler. We can't buy everything like it is a stapler. And this is one of those things that is decidedly not stapler shaped, and we should probably find ways to treat them a little differently. If I can talk a little bit about, you mentioned the risk part of this, and one program we saw from abroad that I found really interesting because it gets at precisely that issue is Business Finland has this program called Innovative Public Procurement. And the reason I like that one a lot is because it's open by application to all kind of government departments, and because Finland's a unitary government, there are municipalities and regional governments as well. And they can basically go and say, hey, we want to do this procurement of whatever it is, that has some innovation component to it. But I don't have the budget to do this. I'm a mid-level public servant. I just think this is an interesting idea. How do we bring it to life? And what this project does after they get an application is they say, okay, great, wonderful. What we'll do is we'll actually give you the budget for you to pursue this through the first couple of steps. And we'll also give you the expertise to go along with it. So you get someone from Business Finland to work with you to say, okay, let's scope out what the outcomes you want are. Let's do some market sounding. Let's talk to some of the potential vendors. And then by the time you're ready to bring this to a full RFP, full procurement process, you're a lot further along than you would have been on your own. And you've had a lot of the risk taken out of it for you. So I think that idea of having expertise and funding to connect that kind of like expertise at the heart of government or within a certain organization and be able to bring that across government and help line departments and agencies de-risk these things for themselves, I think is a really smart model and something we want to see the federal government do, certainly. But also, I think there's lots of room for provincial governments to build on their own expertise here as well.
Oh, yeah. At multiple levels, the government could benefit from this as well. Are there any other recommendations that you made? You wouldn't want to get into the detail, and people should read the report, but are there any other key elements that you should cover?
Yeah, I guess what's interesting, and this one is a little, it's funny, I've had a couple conversations with folks in government about the report, and this one is the one that often gets, can you explain this one to me? And it's the piece around having innovative procurement standards. And standards is a word that I think people gloss over when they see it, but the way we've often talked about at CCI is that it's this invisible layer of governance. Is that you have, I worked in Parliament, and for me, it was totally invisible there because you have laws that Parliament makes and votes on, and then you have regulations that's handled in-house in government. And below that, you have standards, which are not really developed by government. They're developed very collaboratively in the private sector, but often bringing in the public sector, bringing in consumer advocates, whatever it is. And we have an innovation policy blog called Mooseworks, and I have a piece on there called Standards, the Invisible Layer of Governance, and there's a lot of things in daily life that actually work because of standards. And I think I talk about Bluetooth in there and the fact that when you plug something into the wall, it doesn't catch fire and melt into goo. And the reason a lot of that works is because of standards. And it's a really flexible and powerful system of governance that takes a lot of the burden off of government, which is often extremely tight on bandwidth and trying to pursue a lot of competing priorities, and says, okay, let's see if we can get government, the private sector, citizen advocates sit down, work out technical details on a voluntary basis, and then have that work be open. So to my mind, what would be a really useful tool here is to say, we have all these processes in Treasury Board and its equivalents across Canada. Why don't we develop some procurement standards around procuring innovation that sort of stipulate processes for innovation procurement should follow these parameters, should respect these principles, and then have governments be able to say, we recognize this standard, please go ahead and use that as opposed to rigid rules. And that would be, I think, an improvement and give government more flexibility, because ultimately that's the end user here. But I think that's helping government empower itself on a governance front to tackle some of these challenges. So a little abstract, but I think, once again, when you're talking about culture and governance issues, you do need to think at kind of that level.
And it's something we do very well. We have the Digital Governance Council, and there are incredible people who know how to do these things in standards. And we've created some great standards for all kinds of things in Canada and done it very well. It's a good idea. And it gets you past that awful thing of these RFPs. And I could go and spend hours telling you why RFPs don't work. I think everybody knows. The crazy thing is, though, and it goes to the heart of this, and your report is great. It's a great analysis. It should be on everybody's desk, that people should be reading it and they should be going through it. But the question is, we know there's a problem. How are we ever going to get the will to solve this?
Yeah, and that is a $1 trillion question in a lot of ways. Look, I have spent a lot of time in the last couple of years looking at kind of the history of industrial policy or industrial strategy in Canada and innovation policy kind of in particular. And at the end of the day, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that you look at Estonia, you look at Finland, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that they want it more, that they ultimately have a political culture and sort of a set of institutions where these practical problems are taken seriously as problems. And I find often in Canada, we have a lot of trouble tackling these big problems because we see them as optional to tackle, and that there are other things that people seem to value the public sector and political leadership spending its time on. And I don't think there's an easy fix to that. I think people have to want it. And I don't have a pithy answer on that one, but I do think what we lay out in the report are at least some steps that we can take to start rolling that culture boulder uphill and hopefully be able to get it to the top where there can be real lasting change. But yeah, a lot of this is leadership, right? And that is very hard to quantify and make recommendations around.
Yeah. And I think, though, that people really do need to understand, and your report says it clearly, the status quo has a cost. We are not going to maintain our standard of living. We're not. We're not going to have the future for our children that we want to have. Everybody talks about they want their kids to be able to buy a house. Well, they're never going to be able to do that if they don't have a job. And the jobs in the new economy are not, going to be natural resources, unfortunately. And we do very well at that. We've got to somehow get into the digital world. So the need was never greater, and the crisis is here. But that's the thing that concerns me most, is that if people don't tackle this problem, we are going to be in a real gap, and that's going to affect us all.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time worrying about that. And it's certainly the productivity conversation and the innovation conversation to me are intrinsically really connected. And if we don't have big this is going to be mixing metaphors here, but big levers on the gas pedal, then I worry because, yeah, as you say, we are behind in a lot of these metrics. There was some Statistics Canada work today or yesterday that was featured in the Globe about our per capita GDP dipping to, I believe, 7% below trend. It's just, and it sounds dry when you say it like that, but this is how I always put it. Because I hear people sometimes say, oh, all that's happening is we're not getting rich as fast as, the US or other places, but we have these other things to make up for it. And it's two things. First of all, not getting rich as fast is called getting poor. And the other piece is that, frankly, there's lots of. I grew up in the U.S. I can see the advantages of both social models, and ultimately, I voted with my feet and chose to come back to Canada as an adult and make my life here. And I value everything that makes this country really special, but those things they rest on a foundation of broad prosperity that traditionally has come from primary industries, from agriculture. And actually, agriculture is a really interesting innovation industry. That's one of our real leaders in this country, I really got to say. And canola, I think, one of our great industrial policy success stories of taking something from lab to market, and what a market it is. But yeah, so for me, I think these things are really non-optional if we want to maintain both the kind of social model, social values that we have in this country, and frankly, just the standard of living, because I think there's only so long you can go before, people, and actually this is to some extent already happening. I saw a pretty alarming stat the other day that 2/3 of software engineering grads leave Canada.
Yep.
80% of them go to the US. It's 1 in 4 STEM grads. That's pretty alarming. And I worry about that long term. It really is a concern. So for me, getting this kind of innovation policy stuff right It's tremendously important. And my wife and I are expecting a child in September. So this is the first time for us. And now the whole thing about having a future for your kids has become a lot more tangible, and it's alarming. Yeah.
The thing that just drives me crazy in many aspects is the opportunities are there in the things that we want that make our style of living. We could be innovators in healthcare.
Absolutely.
And we have a system that would make that so possible if governments would pull together and start leveraging procurement for innovation and new ideas in healthcare. And we need them. We can't, the current system isn't sustainable.
Yeah. Well, famously, right, people always talk about, doctors use faxes. And yes, true. But like that, to me, as you say, suggests a screaming need to get these systems working much better. And I actually got to talk to a lot of folks in the health innovation space for this report. And I find them, I don't want to speak too much for them because they have expertise I don't. But yeah, they've been working with these systems their whole lives. Most of them have had a lot of exposure to the medical profession if they weren't already medical professionals before starting their businesses. And there's real frustration. And frankly, a lot of the time they got into this because they wanted to make things better for doctors and their colleagues and nurses in delivering frontline services. And they get very frustrated that this is so stymied by these systems that kind of preclude the possibility of innovation. So absolutely. And it's the same, the clean tech challenges we're facing as well. There's big opportunities there to treat this as a meaningful lever in de-risking the development of technologies that can move the needle on emissions reductions, lots of other stuff. There's lots of challenges out there. And this is what I say in the report as well, is that if it were... a lot of the problems that government has to solve are the ones that are hard to make money solving, right? Because otherwise someone would make money solving them. And that's why it's so important, because no one else is going to solve these problems. So we should really be using every lever at our disposal, not just to do this on the innovation policy side and to grow companies, but to solve public problems.
And I think we have to acknowledge that governments around the world are solving this issue better than we are. I point out the fintech industry. We have a huge fintech industry on the West Coast. It sells nothing in Canada. Why? Our regulations are just so intensely bad that they can sell to Australia, they can sell to the US, they can sell to other countries. And maybe you say the US is too risky. Australia is not, and many other places aren't. But they have ways that they can actually buy fintech from Canada, and we can't. It's a crazy system.
Yeah. This is something we heard all the time from our companies when we were putting this report together was, I sell all the time to the US government, to the UK, to Australia, wherever, but I cannot get someone to pick up the phone in Ottawa or around the country. And this is stuff, fintech, yes, absolutely. MedTech, absolutely. But also cybersecurity and cyber defense. This stuff is pretty mission critical. And we have lots of companies that are partnering with SBIR in the States or the Department of Defense or what have you. And once again, just cannot get anything out of our sort of public safety apparatus here in Canada. So it's alarming, because not just because we're going to, or these companies then face a lot of pressure to locate where the money is and where their customers are, but also because we are going to be behind on these tools. And the government put a pretty healthy chunk of change into defense in last week's budget. And there is some language there around procurement reform, and I will be happy to see it when I see it. But yes, this is pretty high stakes stuff at the end of the day.
Yeah. My recommendation to the government has been, get out of the way. Get out of it. And no, I'm not anti-government, but I'm just saying it's broken. Bring in some people who can fix this problem and apply them to fix the problem. The expertise is out there, and it can work. And maybe that will bring together some of the people who already know how to fix the problem in government. And because there are a lot of smart people.
That piece is really important, because I think this is a piece that kind of gets forgotten a lot, is that, and this isn't to knock public servants because this is not their day job, is understanding technologies and marketplaces globally. But we do have folks in government who do understand that quite well. And we point to IRAP, the Industrial Research Assistance Program, as a place that can do, I was mentioning the Finnish program earlier, they can do some of that work, because precisely they have that understanding of both the industrial side and the technological side and the government side. So all three rather than both. But a really talented workforce there. And I think that kind of expertise is rare in government, and that's too bad. It would be really great if there were more folks who had that kind of level of fluency with those different worlds.
And it's a good example. If anybody's ever worked with IRAP, most of the people are highly experienced in business. They are absolutely the fantastic coaches for businesses, and they're hamstrung by regulations that tell them They have to fit a certain mold. If you can imagine, I've actually been told with a straight face from an IRAP rep that our solution was not risky enough. It didn't have a big enough chance of failure. They couldn't fund it. So they're hamstrung too. Smart people hamstrung by bad policies.
Yeah. And that is a story we see all the time. And yeah, procurement is one piece of that. And it's not the only piece, but yeah. Actually, to circle around on your earlier question around, you asked me this right at the beginning. I don't think I ever got to it, was why did we do this report?
Yeah.
And the timing was, it was funny. I remember very vividly having a conversation where I said, I think procurement's going to be the big issue in 8-9 months time when we were planning this out. I got some stares like, really, procurement? And I think the nexus of, we have spent a lot of money as a society in the last couple of years. COVID didn't help on all of this. And we're seeing slowing productivity growth, slowing growth, and also we don't have the financial room that we did a decade ago. And the era of slow growth, low interest rates after the Great Recession seems to be over for, at least for the moment. So we'll see where that goes. I certainly have lost some hubris about my ability to see the macroeconomic future, but we have to do more with less, right? And I think using procurement as this lever where A, we haven't gone into it very much as a country, so it's not like we've tapped it out already. B, it's using resources that we're already spending, and you touched on that 15% stat. It's also 1 in 4 tax dollars, give or take, across the country, or dollars of public spending, I should really say, across all levels of government is procurement. So it's an enormous amount of money that gets spent, and really what we're saying with this and where we see the opportunity is how can you do innovation policy by improving the quality of dollars you're spending rather than improving the quantity. Yeah. And we think that design is something that should really be taken on board. And especially we've articulated different tools that they can use. But yeah, that was really the genesis of this, was looking like, where are the obstacles to doing this better? How can we address those?
You said 15%, but when you take healthcare into account, when you start to ripple through other levels of government, it is an amazing amount of money. If it can ever be brought together as a strategy.
It absolutely is.
At Hashtag Training, we allow our guests to have a magic wand for the final question, and that is, what would you do?
It would be cheap to say I would implement all the recommendations in the report.
One hopes you would, yeah.
But yes, I would do that as a starting point. Really, honestly, I've had a lot of reflection about this, and I've really come to the conclusion that if there were more places like IRAP in government, we would do a lot better on these fronts. I think having that combo of expertise from different worlds and the ability to have frank and human conversations about businesses at a granular level and having that advice function is really important. And frankly, I'm always surprised that, for instance, you'll have Department of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development and Finance will make these big announcements of subsidies and all these things. And I sometimes talk to folks at IRAP, and I always ask them, like, oh, this is a policy or a sector you work on. Did they talk to you? And they say, oh, no. And that's, to me, that's so sad. It's just like they have all these amazing brains that they're not making use of. And I think if you look at countries that do industrial strategy, there is a real concertative quality to it, where they're working with business, with labor, with academia. And it's not just everyone trying to get their piece of the pie. It's everyone really concentrating on how can we really make this a good deal for the long term. And there's a lot of institutional reasons and historical reasons that it hasn't really developed in Canada as naturally as it has in other places. To me, that is a challenge to be overcome and not a reason to just give up on it.
Yeah. And I think, as I said when starting this out, I think this is one of the things that doesn't matter what political party you support. It doesn't even matter if you're really a conservative or a socialist even. This is something we should all be able to get together on and really drive forward for the future of our country.
Yeah, spending public money well, to me, is the almost typical issue of we should actually pretty much all agree on this.
Thank you so much for coming in, Laurent. This has been great. I hope we haven't admired the problem too much. I hope I hope people will read your report, and I hope that they will.
I hope so too.
They'll talk to people, talk to their MP. I will say the one thing: every one of these MPs reads letters. Send them an old-fashioned
And I'll tell
letter.
you, in fact, call them.
Or call them. Yeah. No, I agree.
Yeah, because, boy, let me tell you, when I worked in Charlie's office, we'd get 500, 600 emails a day. maybe a dozen phone calls, and the phone calls tend to stick out. So this is much broader than innovation procurement. But if you ever really want to hear back from your MP, give them a call because they will remember. Be nice, though.
Absolutely.
The staff are,
and be nice,
are good
because
folks.
they are real human beings. Our guest today has been Laurent Carbonneau. He's representing the Council of Canadian Innovators, and this report is something I think everyone in technology should read and spread it around. We will post a link in the show notes of this so you can find that. For listeners who've been with us for a long time, there's a new location for the show notes. Our new home is at technewsday.ca. We're in the midst of reshaping that publication, but the latest podcast is right there on the front page. So click on it, and you can get the links to this report. I'd love to hear your opinions on the story today. And again, we risk admiring the problem, but this is something where I think people do need to realize we are in a crisis. You can reach me at editorial@technewsday.ca, or write me on my personal email, therealjimlove@gmail.com, or catch me on LinkedIn or phone me, whatever. Let me know what you think about this or anything else on the show. And if you like the show, share it with a friend. This is an issue that we really do want to get out there and get some conversation about. Thanks today to my guest, Laurent Carbonneau, the Council of Canadian Innovators.
Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks to you for sharing your weekend with me. I'll be back in this seat on Monday morning with the latest tech news. And that's it. Have a great weekend.